Be me claims adjuster at a mid-size insurance company. Been there 6 years, know every form, every policy number, every client quirk by heart. Not a glamorous job, but it pays well, and nobody bothers you if your numbers are good. Desk job, suits, spreadsheets, the whole comfortable, boring routine the department runs. Maybe 12 people total, mostly guys who've been there long enough to know where the good stapler is hidden. There's one dude who's been sitting across from me for 4 years. We'll call him Doug. Doug is the kind of guy who fixes the printer without being asked, remembers everyone's coffee order, and brings donuts on Fridays for no reason other than that's who he is. Genuinely solid human being. Then there's Walt, older guy, sits in the far corner by the window, grumbles constantly about everything, but knows the claims process better than anyone else in the building, by a significant margin. Walt once caught a fraud case that saved the company somewhere around $400,000. Management gave him a $20 gift card to Applebee's. As a thank you, Walt has not forgiven them for this. Walt will never forgive them for this. The three of us basically ran the department in practice, even though none of us had any official management title. Our actual manager at the time was this older guy who had been there since before I started. Calm, reasonable, let people work. He retired after some health stuff. There was a cake in the break room, everyone clapped. He looked genuinely relieved to be leaving. And then silence. Nobody said anything about who was coming in. Next, HR sent an email a week or so later saying a new team lead would be joining us soon, and that we should all be prepared for what they described as a refreshing shift in team culture. Doug read that email, looked at me, and didn't say a word. Walt printed it out, read it standing at the printer, folded it once, and put it through the paper shredder. I should have taken that as a sign. A few weeks passed, and then she showed up. I was at my desk going through a stack of auto claims when I heard heels clicking down the hallway. Our department is not really a heels-clicking kind of hallway. She walked in before anyone from HR even came to introduce her, confident, loud, dressed like she was about to give a talk at some conference about disrupting corporate culture, had a laptop covered in stickers. One said something like, "The future is female." Another one had a slogan I couldn't read because the font was tiny and decorative. She introduced herself to the whole room, standing in the middle of the floor, like she'd already measured the space and decided it was hers. Called a team meeting immediately. Within the first 30 minutes of being there, we all shuffled into the conference room and sat down. She stood at the whiteboard with a marker and smiled at us. The first 10 minutes were completely fine. She talked about productivity, client satisfaction, building team trust. The standard things I thought, okay, this might actually be manageable. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of printed papers and slid copies down the table, like someone dealing cards. I looked at mine. The header read, Team Communication Improvement Initiative. I read the first bullet point it said, and I am paraphrasing because I no longer have the exact wording memorized, that using the word no when directed toward a female supervisor constitutes a form of dismissive communication that reinforces hierarchical dominance patterns and undermines collaborative team dynamics. I read that sentence 3 times. Walt, from the corner of the room, said, "I'm sorry." What she smiled at him and explained that declining requests from management in a direct and blunt way creates a hostile environment, and that going forward, the team would be transitioning to more collaborative and constructive language. Walt started to form another sentence. She smiled wider and said she was sure he'd find the adjustment straightforward. Something about that particular smile made Walt close his mouth. He looked at the paper instead. I looked at Doug. Doug was reading the document with the precise expression of a man who has just realized the car he is driving has no brakes and is now very carefully calculating the hill ahead. On the drive home that evening, I told myself this was probably just one of those corporate initiatives that sounds extreme on paper, but quietly dies after a month when nobody enforces it. A lot of companies do exactly that. Some consultant comes in, everyone nods through a seminar, nothing actually changes. I was very wrong about that. Over the following weeks, she started building on top of the first document. New rules appeared in new memos. First, it was just the language thing. Then she added a rule about not interrupting women during meetings. That one sounds reasonable in isolation until you realize she interrupted people constantly and without apology, mostly men. Mostly mid-sentence. Then came something about not standing when she was seated, because it supposedly created an unnecessary physical power dynamic in the room. I started actually thinking about whether I was allowed to stand up to go get coffee. While she was sitting nearby, Walt started tracking it at one point. I caught him watching his own movements relative to where she was positioned in the room. The eye contact rule was probably the strangest addition. She distributed a memo explaining that sustained direct eye contact from male employees could be interpreted as a form of intimidation. The memo did not define what sustained meant in any measurable way. So, looking at her too long was a problem, and looking away too quickly was probably also somehow a problem, and there was no clear line between the two. Doug spent some time genuinely trying to calculate the correct number of seconds of eye contact that would read as normal versus aggressive. He landed somewhere between 1.5 and 2 seconds. He told me this in complete seriousness. Walt said he was going to start wearing sunglasses indoors. He was only half joking. The thing about all of this is that none of it was written into any actual official HR policy. It was all coming from her personal documents, her personal memos, her personal interpretation of what a healthy team environment looked like, distributed and enforced through her own authority in HR, meaning the woman she had apparently befriended almost immediately upon arriving backed everything. I know they were friends because they ate lunch together every single day, and once I overheard them in the break room talking about a yoga class, they both went to any complaint about the new rules, therefore went directly to the one person who had already decided the rules were excellent. Walt figured out this particular structural problem before either of us, and it made him quieter than usual. Not the normal Walt, quiet where he's ignoring something. The other kind of quiet where a man is very carefully deciding what to actually do. I want to describe what it looked like in practice when these rules ran into actual work, because on paper it sounds like something you could navigate around, and in reality it was a different experience entirely. She would come to my desk and tell me she needed me to take on additional case files beyond my regular workload. The previous manager never did this unilaterally. If the team needed extra hands, he'd ask, and it was presented as a choice, but she would stand there and state what she needed and look at me. The only response available that wouldn't get flagged as dismissive, aggressive, or resistant was some variation of, "Yes, I tried once," early on, to explain calmly that I was already at full capacity and that taking on more files would start affecting my accuracy on the cases already in process. She wrote something in her notebook while I was still talking. 2 days later, I got an email with HRCCD saying that I had demonstrated resistance to collaborative team dynamics. I looked at that email for a long time. This was not a performance issue. I had good numbers for 6 straight years. My files were clean. My clients were handled. My accuracy rate was one of the highest in the department. But the framing of the email made it look like I had some kind of attitude problem that needed to be corrected. I showed Doug the email on my phone. He read it, handed the phone back to me, and sat quietly for about a minute. Then he said he had an idea. We waited until the office had mostly cleared out. That late afternoon stretch where it's just the fluorescent hum and the cleaning crew starting in the hallway, Doug pulled his chair over and laid it out. The rule was that we couldn't say no, so we were not going to say no. We were going to say yes, complete, immediate, cheerful, unconditional yes to everything. And then we were going to do exactly what we had the capacity to do and nothing beyond that. No arguing, no explaining capacity, no pushback of any kind. Just a smile, a nod, absolutely. I'll look into that. And then look into nothing. I sat with that. For a moment, it sounded almost insultingly simple. Doug said the system she had built was specifically designed to punish resistance. If there was no resistance visible anywhere, there was nothing to punish. You cannot write someone up for being agreeable. You cannot formally discipline a man for smiling too genuinely at his manager without looking completely unhinged in front of legal. And Doug said, good, there was no handshake or speech about it, just 2 guys at their desks deciding to stop fighting a rule that couldn't be fought directly and start working entirely around it. Instead, the following Monday, I tried it for real. For the first time, she came over to my desk mid-morning and said she needed me to take on a batch of commercial liability reviews. In addition to my regular case files, I looked up from what I was doing, made eye contact for the appropriate duration, and said absolutely, I'll start incorporating those into my workflow right away. She nodded and walked away. I wrote it in my notepad to make it look like I was tracking it. I did not do it. I finished my regular work the same way I would on any other day. She came by a couple of days later and asked where things stood. With the commercial reviews, I looked up with the same expression and said I was still working through the most effective approach and would have an update for her shortly. She looked mildly annoyed. There was nothing to grab onto. I had not said no. I had not argued. I had not been rude or resistant or dismissive. I was exploring options. I was circling back. I was actioning the request through careful consideration. Doug was doing the same thing from his desk. His signature phrase became, "I hear you and I want to make sure I action this correctly," which he could deliver with a level of apparent sincerity that was genuinely impressive to observe. Walt took considerably longer to get there. Walt is not a man built for nodding and smiling. His whole personality is constructed around saying what he means directly and without decoration. His first attempt at the approach came out stilted and unconvincing, like someone speaking a language they learned from a phrasebook the night before. But then she sent him a written notice for demonstrating dismissive body language during a team sync. The specific offense was that he had crossed his arms during a meeting. Walt crossed his arms because the conference room air conditioning runs extremely cold, and he was uncomfortable after receiving a formal written notice for being cold. Walt got very motivated very quickly. I watched him practice the smile at his desk when he thought no one was paying attention. Sitting there, looking at his monitor, just running the expression on his face and adjusting it, the man was genuinely rehearsing a neutral smile, the way someone rehearses a presentation. By the end of that week, all three of us were running the same approach. The rest of the team picked up on something shifting in how the three of us were operating, but nobody asked direct questions about it. A couple of the other guys started mirroring the pattern without anyone explaining anything explicitly. It just spread the way things spread in a small office when people are paying close attention. And the reason for the behavior is obvious enough that it doesn't need words. She noticed me first out of all of them. I think it was because the others had small visible seams in the performance. Doug's smile occasionally went slightly too wide, the specific expression of a man holding a poker face just past the natural limit. Walt's version still carried a faint controlled edge to it, this compressed flatness that, if you had spent any time around him, you recognized as not quite his real face, but somewhere along the way, I had apparently landed on something that read as genuinely calm rather than performed calm. It wasn't even strategic on my part. I had just gotten tired of being stressed about the whole situation, and at some point, the external version of me matched what was actually happening internally, which was mostly exhausted indifference. She started directing questions at me more often during meetings, checking in with me specifically, calling on me by name, watching my face while other people were talking. I think she was looking for the fracture line. She would ask something pointed and then hold eye contact waiting for a reaction. She got the same face every time, attentive, interested, completely empty of anything she could use. She asked me once directly in front of the full team whether I personally believed male employees had a responsibility to actively support female leadership. I said yes, absolutely. That a strong team dynamic required genuine contribution from everyone and that I was committed to. That she waited like she expected something else to follow. Nothing came. She moved on after the meeting. Walt caught me in the hallway and said, "Nice, just that single word." Then went back to his desk a few days after that. She called me into her office for a one-on-one. She had her notebook open and told me she had concerns about my engagement levels. I asked her to walk me through what she meant by that. Specifically, she said she felt I wasn't bringing genuine energy to the team. Initiatives I asked, which initiatives in particular she would like me to focus on more actively. She didn't have a specific answer ready for that. She pivoted and told me she was also concerned that my general positivity might be coming across as insincere to some people. I want to make sure I understood that correctly. So I asked whether she was saying that having a positive attitude was creating a problem. She said not exactly, but that it could be perceived by some as a form of passive resistance. I told her I would absolutely take that feedback seriously and reflect on how I was showing up and make sure I was being as authentic as possible in my interactions. She wrote in her notebook. I sat and waited. Eventually she said, that would be all. I thanked her for taking the time and left. When I got back to my desk, Doug glanced over and raised his eyebrows. I gave him a small shrug. He mouthed the word, and I mouthed back nothing. He exhaled slowly through his nose and returned to his monitor. Then she tried to make something official out of it. She submitted a formal complaint to HR, which the HR woman forwarded to me with a note saying I was being asked to respond. In writing the complaint, stated that I had demonstrated sustained passive resistance through performative compliance, and that my behavior constituted a form of workplace undermining performative compliance. I read that phrase probably 6 or 7 times. She was saying that agreeing with her too smoothly was itself a form of breaking the rules. She was saying that following the guidelines too well was actually a violation of the guidelines. I took my time writing the response. I said I had consistently made every effort to meet all team communication guidelines, that I welcomed any specific examples of tasks I had failed to complete or conduct that had fallen outside acceptable professional behavior, and that I remained fully committed to contributing positively to the department and to the team. I attached 2 months of completed case files. My numbers were clean, everything filed correctly, everything within appropriate timeframes, everything exactly where it needed to be. HR sat on the complaint for a while, and then nothing happened. No formal action, no follow-up meeting. Nothing, because there was genuinely nothing to formally act on. A man who smiles at his manager and files his work correctly is not a disciplinary case, no matter how you frame the complaint. Walt, after I told him about it, said that if she tried to formally discipline someone for being too agreeable, she would have to explain her reasoning to the director, and then potentially to legal. He said this with the specific dry satisfaction of someone watching a badly constructed plan begin to fall apart. I told him to keep his voice down. He kept his voice down, but he kept the satisfaction. Around this time, the smaller absurdities started piling up in ways that would have been funny if we weren't living inside them. She introduced a weekly check-in format for team meetings where every person had to share one thing they were grateful for before we could discuss actual work. Walt's first contribution was that he was grateful the coffee machine had been restocked with dark roast. She wrote something down his second week. He said he was grateful for the clear weather. She asked him to try to make it more personal and team-oriented. He said he was grateful for his colleagues. She seemed satisfied with that. Doug started rotating through an extremely consistent set of answers that were technically heartfelt and also said nothing. Things like, "I'm grateful for the chance to grow professionally," or "I appreciate the opportunity to serve our clients well." She always nodded at these like they were meaningful. There was also a new protocol around how you raised concerns in meetings. You couldn't just say there's a problem with this approach. You had to frame everything as an opportunity for collaborative exploration. So instead of saying this deadline is not realistic, you were supposed to say something like, "I'm wondering if we might explore alternative timelines that allow for optimal quality delivery." Walt once spent 45 seconds constructing that exact sentence in real time during a meeting, while the rest of us watched his face during those 45 seconds was completely neutral. Doug had to look at his notes. I looked at the whiteboard. The meeting continued. No timeline was changed. The situation with the client is where the whole thing started moving towards something that couldn't be contained. She had been pushing to bring in a larger corporate account, the kind of business that would raise the department's profile and also look good, specifically for her. She landed it after a few conversations with people upstairs. There was an initial meeting scheduled with the client to walk through the scope. Me, Doug, and Walt were in the room because we were the senior people on claims, and this was a claims-heavy account. The client sent 2 people, both clearly had done their homework, asked specific questions, knew what they were talking about. She ran the meeting from her end. Things went fine for a while. Then they asked about the timeline for processing a full portfolio review. This is not a simple task. It involves hundreds of policy documents across multiple coverage types, cross-referencing with prior claim histories, checking for inconsistencies, building out a summary report that holds up to scrutiny. A job like that done correctly and without cutting corners takes a minimum of 3 months, probably closer to 4 if the portfolio has any unusual elements. Everyone in that room who actually knew the work understood this. She looked at me from across the table. She asked whether the team could turn around the full review in 1 month. I kept my expression level and said we would do everything possible to meet client needs and deliver at the highest standard. She turned to the clients and said, 1 month, guaranteed. Doug, sitting diagonally across from me, blinked once very slowly, like a man watching something fall off a shelf in slow motion. Walt was looking at his pen. I looked at the wall behind the client's head for a second, and then back to the table. Nobody said anything else about the timeline in that meeting. Everyone shook hands at the end. The clients left, and we rode the elevator back up in silence. I watched the floor numbers change. Doug looked at his phone without actually reading anything on it. Walt looked at the ceiling with an expression that on anyone else would look like mild curiosity. But on Walt means something different. None of us said a word. We all already knew what was coming. The month went exactly the way. A month like that goes. We processed what we could process correctly. We did not rush things in ways that would introduce errors, because errors would create a different and worse problem down the line. At the end of the month, the portfolio review was somewhere around 30% complete. The client called the director. I know because the office developed a specific kind of atmospheric pressure that afternoon. The tension that spreads through a building when someone important is having a very bad conversation on a floor above you. The director called her in. She came out of that meeting with a tightly controlled expression and called a team meeting for the next morning. In the team meeting, she said the department had failed to deliver on its commitments and that she was genuinely disappointed in the team's collective output. Walt asked, in the most neutral voice I had ever heard him use, what the original basis for the timeline estimate had been. She said she had relied on input from the team when setting that expectation. Walt looked at me, I looked at my notepad, Doug looked at the window. She said she would be raising performance concerns with HR for the relevant team members. After the meeting broke up, Doug leaned over and said very quietly that she had just told the director her own team had misled her about what was achievable. He said it the way you say something when you've already anticipated the outcome and are just waiting for the sequence to finish. The director ordered an external audit, I found out from an email, that went to the entire department, which was a slightly unusual way to communicate something like that. The audit was framed as a review of departmental workflow and resource allocation processes. An outside firm was coming in to look at how work was being assigned, tracked, and completed. That included internal communications, team documentation, management records, all of it. She spent the next several days going through her files and printing things. She also started being noticeably more careful about how she spoke in team meetings, less declarative, more consultative, asking things like, what does the team think, when previously she had simply told the team what to think. Walt watched this shift happen over 2 or 3 days and mentioned to me quietly that she was trying to establish a retrospective paper trail that made her look collaborative. I said, I had noticed. He said it wasn't going to work. I said I knew the auditors arrived and were quiet and professional, and asked for large quantities of documents. They interviewed each of us individually in a small room with the door closed. I went in, sat down across from them, answered what they asked. They asked how work was typically assigned in the department. I said through direct requests from management, sometimes documented in email, sometimes verbal. They asked whether workload concerns were typically raised with management. I said yes. And that I had personally found it challenging at times to communicate capacity issues effectively within the current communication framework. They asked me to explain what I meant by that. I said there had been guidelines put in place by the current team lead that shaped how certain types of direct responses could be delivered to management. They asked for more detail. I walked them through the document she had distributed when she first arrived, the one that explained that saying no to a female supervisor was a form of dominance behavior. I had kept my copy in my desk drawer. I had not thrown it out for no particular reason, other than that I just hadn't gotten around to it. I handed it to them. They read it without reacting, visibly. One of them wrote something at length. The other one asked if I had any other documentation related to team communication policies. I gave them the full set of memos she had issued over the months. The eye contact one, the standing one, the interrupting one, the grateful check-in format. All of it. They thanked me, and I went back to my desk. Neither Doug nor Walt told me exactly what they said. In their sessions, we didn't really discuss it. Some things you don't need to coordinate. The final meeting came with not much warning. An email went out saying there would be a full departmental review in the main conference room, and that attendance was required for all team members. The director would be there, the auditors would be there, and the client was also going to be present, which was not something anyone in the department had expected. I assume the director invited them because the entire situation had originated from the broken promise to that account, and they had their own questions that needed answering. We filed into the conference room and sat down the table. In there is the long kind, the one they only bring people into for things that matter. Director at the head of the table, auditors positioned to his left with folders in front of them, client reps at the far end with their own documents. HR was there too, in a chair slightly pulled back from the actual table, positioned like someone who is present but does not want to be. The three of us sat along one side. She sat across from us with her laptop open and a folder and the specific expression of someone who studied hard for a test and is no longer fully confident they identified the right material. The director opened the meeting by saying the audit had raised questions about departmental management, practices, and resource allocation, and that the goal was to understand what had happened with the client account and how the team functioned day to day. She started talking. She said she had encountered significant resistance from the team since arriving. She said communication had been difficult. She said she had attempted to implement positive structural changes and had found pushback at every stage. The director asked what form that pushback took. She said the male members of the team had been consistently uncooperative. He asked her to give specific examples. She started talking about attitude and energy and body language and the general tone of interactions. He asked if there were documented performance failures he should be aware of. She mentioned the client account and the timeline. He asked who had committed to that timeline. She said she had done so based on information and input from the team. Walt shifted very slightly in his chair. The director looked at the auditors. One of them opened a folder and placed a document on the table in front of the director. It was a copy of her original communication guidelines. The director looked at it for a moment and then read a portion of it aloud, specifically the section explaining that declining requests from management constituted dismissive behavior inconsistent with collaborative team dynamics. He put it down on the table and looked at her. He asked directly whether, under the guidelines she had distributed and enforced, a team member would have been able to tell her that the 1-month timeline was not achievable. She started explaining that the guidelines were about creating respectful and constructive communication patterns, not about preventing honest feedback. He repeated the question more plainly under the rules she had put in place. Could someone on the team have said no to that timeline? The room was quiet for a moment. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at him. She looked across at me briefly. I was looking at the surface of the table in front of me. The director asked a third time, even more simply, yes or no? Was it possible under her own communication policy for a team member to directly reject that timeline as unrealistic? She did not answer. One of the client reps at the far end of the table said something quietly to the other one. The auditor wrote something in the folder. The director sat back and said they would continue the conversation. Privately, the meeting was over. People stood. The room broke into smaller conversations near the door. She was standing next to her chair and not talking to anyone. I collected my things and walked out without looking back. The week that followed was quiet in the specific way that comes after something loud. There were closed-door meetings I wasn't part of, a few of them running long. HR seemed to be away from their desk. For extended stretches, she was still physically in the building for most of that week. But she didn't call any team meetings and the memos stopped completely. Walt told me he'd heard from someone in accounting that the director had been on the phone with the legal department. Doug said he'd heard the same thing independently from someone else. I didn't hear it from either source. I just watched the building feel different at some point. During that week she came in, spent a few hours at her desk, doing something I couldn't see from where I sat. Went to a meeting that nobody told us about. Came back, put her laptop into its bag along with a framed photo from her desk and a small plant, and left no announcement, no email to the team, no speech, no cake, just there and then not there. The HR woman got quietly reassigned to a different office location. I found out when her name stopped appearing in the internal directory for our floor. The director held a short team meeting a few days after he kept it brief and practical. He said the department would be moving through a management review period, and that in the meantime the senior team members should continue operating, as they had been prior to the disruption. He said direct communication was expected and encouraged at all levels. Going forward, he said that any workload concerns should be raised immediately and clearly without hesitation. When he said that last part, he looked around the table. Nobody said anything dramatic. Walt gave a single slow nod. Doug wrote something in his notebook. I said, understood the director, thanked everyone for their patience, and left the room. People pushed chairs back and headed out. Doug stopped at my desk on the way back to his and set a coffee down without saying anything. It was from the place down the street, not from the machine in the break room. He went back to his seat. Walt was putting his jacket on at the far end and glanced over. Once didn't say anything, didn't need to. Just the kind of look that carries enough weight without requiring words to hold it up. I drank the coffee and opened my case files, auto claims, liability reviews, commercial policies. The same ordinary stack that had been there before. Any of this started, I worked through them the same way I had for 6 years. Except now when I had too many, I said so directly, and nobody sent me an email about it afterward. I've thought about what that whole period actually was when I try to describe it to people who weren't there, not in terms of office politics or strategy or any of that framing, just in terms of what it felt like from where I was sitting on a regular Tuesday going through insurance paperwork. It wasn't satisfying in any clean way. None of it felt like winning, because it was never supposed to be a competition in the first place. It was just work. And then someone arrived and spent 6 months turning the work into something else. The system she built was specifically designed so that any disagreement could be labeled as the problem. If you pushed back, you were aggressive. If you said no, you were domineering. If you pointed out something was unrealistic, you were resistant to female leadership. The only way through it without becoming the villain in her version of events was to stop giving her anything visible to point at. So, I don't know what she actually believed about what was happening in that department, whether she genuinely thought we were coordinating against her, or whether she knew on some level that she had built something that didn't function and couldn't acknowledge it. She was so committed to the idea that any friction she encountered was men being threatened by her authority that she never seriously looked at whether her authority was producing anything useful. The project failed because she made a promise to a client that she didn't understand, was impossible, and the people who understood it was impossible had been specifically trained not to say. So, that isn't a story about men resisting a woman in charge. That's a story about a person who constructed a system that made it structurally impossible for anyone to tell her the truth, and then was genuinely surprised when the truth showed up anyway in the form of 2 auditors with a folder and an unhappy client. At the end of a very long conference table, she called it toxic positivity. Once, the thing I was doing, I thought about that phrase for a long time. After the idea that a man being calm and cooperative and continuing to do his job correctly was somehow a form of toxicity. What she actually wanted was something that read more like visible deference, not just compliance, but a certain kind of energy in the room that reflected her authority back at her. And when she didn't get that energy, when she just got quiet, men filing their work correctly and smiling at the appropriate intervals, she didn't know what to do with it. There was nothing to fight, so she tried to manufacture something to fight. The formal complaint about performative compliance was her attempting to create a conflict out of the absence of conflict. Because the absence of conflict was the thing confusing her, I'm not angry about any of it anymore. I was, for a stretch, particularly during the period when the HR complaint was sitting open, and I didn't know how far it was going to go, or whether it would affect my standing in a way that followed me, but that passed. Mostly I just think it was a waste of a significant amount of everyone's time. 6 months of careful, exhausting navigation through nonsense that did not need to exist. A client relationship that got damaged because someone made a guarantee they didn't have the knowledge to back up a department that ran well and then ran badly and then ran well again. The only real cost was the months in between. Doug still sits across from me, still brings donuts on Fridays. Walt's grumbling has returned to its natural state, which is complaints about actual work problems, software that updates at inconvenient times, processing errors in the system, the coffee machine running low on dark roast again. Normal grumbling, the healthy kind that means someone gives enough of a damn about the work to be annoyed when it doesn't function. Right? I still have a copy of the original communication guidelines in my desk drawer, not because I kept it strategically, I just never threw it out. And at some point, it stopped mattering, whether I did. Every so often I open the drawer for something else and see it sitting there under some other papers. A printed document explaining that a man saying no to his manager is a form of aggressive dominance behavior and must be replaced with more collaborative language. I think about what it actually costs when the person running something becomes more interested in controlling how the room feels than in whether the room produces anything real. Then I close the drawer and I go back to the claims. MFW, the auditor's final report, described the management approach as creating structural barriers to accurate operational feedback. That's the formal written way of saying she built a system that made it impossible for anyone to tell her she was wrong. MFW, when the rule designed to silence the men in the room, became the single document that ended her time. It didn't argue, didn't fight, didn't do anything except smile and let the work be the work and wait for the truth to catch up on its own timeline. The truth always catches up. It just needed some time and a client on a very bad phone call and 2 auditors with a folder and 1 printed memo that somebody kept in a desk drawer for no particular reason at all.